Alrighty. So this week we're going to be learning about the Trojan War, and not just about. So we will talk about Homer and his recounting of the events of the Trojan War and the return home in the Iliad, in the Odyssey. We will be sort of talking about other accounts as related to us in tragedies, as like different Greek tragedies, or as related to us in even Roman epics. For instance, a lot of what we know about what happens to the Trojans comes not in Greek epic, but more so in like Virgil's Aeneid. Virgil's Aeneid, for instance. So, but like all who discuss the Trojan War, we will begin with Homer. So Homer, also known as the Blind Bard, is a poet who in the 8th century is going around Greece and recounting these epics of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Whether Homer exists or not is something that scholars have debated for hundreds of and thousands of years. I mean, really, since antiquity, people have questioned whether Homer was real or not. Regardless of whether there's a person named Homer who's blind, who's going around telling these stories, what we know is that it's here in the 8th century, when Homer is said to have lived, that the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey are written down and codified. So these are common enough stories, but now we see them sort of become, I mean, we talk about things being quote unquote canon today, right? So things become canonical, they become codified when they're written down and presented in a certain way. So this happens with the Iliad and the Odyssey. So the Iliad, of course, being the main, I say here, the main narrative of the Trojan War, but it really is the events of the final year of the Trojan War. And then the Odyssey, which is about the return home of Odysseus from the Trojan War, but we also find out about the return of many of his other comrades. One term that you should be familiar with is this term in medias res. This is Latin for in the middle of things. And this is where Homer's Iliad and his Odyssey start. We don't just start with day one, year 10 of the Trojan War, right? Or day one, year one of the Trojan War. We start right in the middle. Things that happened before that we find out during the narrative or during the epic. Things happen after, and things will happen after it and during it. So these epics not only are dealing with moments of the present, but the recounting of the past also. I should also mention what an epic is. So an epic, when this was told, this is told in meter. In meter. The meter that Homer reads his poems, and if you were sitting here reading in Greek, you would read in the dactylic hexameter. The dactylic hexameter, which is often, and it really, I should really mention, it really is it's the use of meter that makes this an epic, plus, of course, the length of it. I'm not great with meter, so I'm not going to try to explain more than give you the name, the dactylic hexameter. I mean, the only meter that I'm really good with, let's say, is like even Shakespearean meter, right? Hark, what light through yonder window breaks, 'tis the east. So, like Shakespeare, for instance, is writing in I think his is iambic pentameter or something like that, but he's writing in meter. So there would be a groove to this, to this. Sing, O Muse, which is how, of course, the Iliad begins. I love this, and this is actually something that's worth noting how these begin. Because it really is in the beginning that we find out what this is about. What's the Iliad really about? Sing, Muse, the anger of Peleus' son Achilles, and its devastation, which put pains thousandfold upon the Achaeans, hurled in their multitudes to the house of Hades strong souls of heroes, but gave their bodies to be delicate feastings of dogs and all birds, and the will of Zeus was accomplished. Since that time, when first there stood in division of conflict Atreus' son, lord of all men, and brilliant Achilles. Sing, O Muse, the anger of Achilles. Book 1 tells us why Achilles is mad. Book 24 tells us it ends with his anger being satiated. The Odyssey begins. Tell me, Muse, of the man of many ways, who has driven far journeys after he had sacked Troy's sacred citadel. Many were those whose cities he saw, whose minds he learned of, many the pains he suffered, and in his spirit on the wide sea struggled for his own life and the homecoming of his companions. Even so, he could not save his companions, hard though he strove to. They were destroyed by their own wild recklessness, fools who devour the oxen of Helios, the sun god, and he took away the days of their homecoming. From some point here, goddess, daughter Zeus speak and begin our story. Tell me, Muse, of the man of many ways. In many ways, the Odyssey is about man, the journey that, right? So we have Homer recount this story. I should mention I want to take a step back from Homer just for a second, because I've mentioned the idea that, and I mentioned it in my email this week, that the Trojan War becomes the moment where the physical world that the Greeks are living in is now has representations, has monuments, has architecture and structures from the period of the Trojan War. There are Bronze Age. If the Trojan War happened in the ancient Bronze Age, which is when a historical area when the Greeks believed it happened, there are these palatial structures where kings ruled over cities. There is evidence for were warrior societies. There's evidence for collapse, which I talked about at the very beginning of the semester. And then there are these ruins that the Greeks are constantly interacting with. They're there, they're part of their daily lives. So I want to talk a little bit here about this, what I call the historical Troy. So in 1870, this German-born entrepreneur named Heinrich Schliemann, that's a name you should remember, Heinrich Schliemann, who loves reading Homer. He's a very rich, wealthy man, decides that he is going to find ancient Troy and ancient Mycenae and Ithaca, the city of Agamemnon, the city of Priam, and the city of Odysseus. Supposedly using Homer as his guide, he unearths a city in modern-day Turkey that in its stratigraphy, and actually we could talk about what stratigraphy is, but basically, as you dig down, you uncover different strata. And there is definitely a Troy, a city in this location that had a large population. So this, of course, would have been Troy 6, a city with a large population and large tall walls that was burned to the ground. And there is evidence of warfare there. The Greeks themselves didn't just see the Trojan War as myth. Here, we actually have the historian Thucydides, and Herodotus does the same. But what does he say? And it was, I think, because Agamemnon surpassed in power the prince of his time, that he was able to assemble his fleet, and not so much because of Helen's suitors, whom he led, were bound by the oath of Tyndareus. It is said, furthermore, by those in the Peloponnese, they have received the clearest traditional accounts from the men of former times. Those by means of the great wealth which he brought with him from Asia to the midst of the poor people, that Pelops first acquired power. Consequently, stranger though he was, gave his name to the country, and that yet greater things fell on his lot to his descendants. And it was, I think, because Agamemnon had inherited all this, and at the same time had become strong in naval power beyond the rest, that he was able to collect his armament, not so much by favor as by fear, and so to make the expedition. Like I said, Herodotus also begins his histories. I should mention this is Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. In Herodotus' history, he also sees the snatching of Helen as just this back and forth of people from Turkey coming to Greece and snatching people, and vice versa, and this like going back and forth of snatching people. You might be wondering who this woman is. Maybe I should mention Miss Schliemann, Miss Sophia Schliemann, who is Heinrich Schliemann's second wife, who he marries to essentially get favor in Greece. This is her actually wearing some of the golden jewelry that they found in this city of Troy, where they unearthed tons of gold jewelry. She called, what was this? This is the jewelry of, that was her name escaping me. Yeah, so this is the jewelry of I can't remember Priam's wife's name. Hecuba. That's right. Hecuba's, supposedly Hecuba's gold. Anyway, they discover this jewelry. It's actually, they smuggle it from the country. This is why a lot of countries, their archaeological rules are very strict. So they smuggle it out of the country. They sew it in her dress. And it's actually was just rediscovered. He donated the gold to a museum in Berlin. And it was actually just discovered about 20 years ago now, 15 years ago now, 15, 20 years ago now, in the in a museum basement in Russia. So as the Russians invaded Berlin at the World War II, they actually took this from the museum there. And we'll talk, and actually in the next week's lecture also, when we talk about the house of Atreus, we'll also talk a little bit about some of the stuff he discovered in Mycenae. So what I want you to take away from this is there was a real city in the geographical location of Troy supposedly was. There was a war fought around it during the Bronze Age, and the city was burned to the ground. On top of the archaeological evidence, and while I'm talking about that, maybe we'll talk a little bit about this. You see some of these fortifications in what would be modern day, like if you were to go to Troy today. On top of all of that, we do have one, basically in the archives in the Hittite city of the Hittite capital of Hattusas. There is a clay tablet that was burned when that city was burned. That is a letter sent from Alexandros of Welusa. I'm sorry. Yeah, Alexandros of Welusa, and they were being attacked by the Akiawa. And asking for help. Now, what you might not know is that Paris, who we'll talk about here in a minute, his other name is Alexander. Akiawa, of course, very much resembles Achaean. Welusa is posited that it is this Turkish name or this Hittite name for the city of Troy. So we do, and they talk about being attacked and these raiders coming from the sea. So there is some level of evidence here. Not that I'm trying to convince you that the Trojan War happened, but definitely, at the very least, the Greeks themselves very much believed it happened, and there is some evidence that something on this scale and at this level happened. So let's talk about the backstory a little bit of the Trojan War. So let's begin with the birth of Helen and then the marriage of Peleus and Thetis. Okay. So we begin with, like I said, we begin with Helen. So basically, Leda is one of these, one of these women who has a child with Zeus. Zeus hides him, basically disguises himself as a swan and comes down, and Leda sleeps with him. She also sleeps with her husband around this time. And basically, she gets pregnant and she lays 2 eggs. Can't make this stuff up, people. So she lays 2 eggs. When these eggs crack, from one egg comes Polydeuces and Helen. These are the children of Zeus. And from the other egg comes Castor and Clytemnestra, who are the children of Tyndareus, Leda's husband. We, of course, have seen Castor and Pollux already, as they were on the Argo with Jason, and they sailed to Colchis and back with Jason. We actually see them later pop up in, their names are Castor and Pollux in Roman mythology. We actually see them pop up later in Roman myth, having they actually show up in Rome and help the Romans win a battle. So we have the birth of Helen, and then the marriage of Peleus and Thetis. Oh, why am I? Could have swore sorry, I'm like giving the preview here, but I could have swore I had a slide on the oath of Tyndareus. Oh, well, I'll come back to the oath of Tyndareus. Okay, so we have the marriage of Peleus and Thetis, who of course are Peleus is Achilles' father and Thetis is his mother. All of the gods assemble. So this is a separate event from the birth of Helen. Except the god Eris or Discord is not invited. Obviously, you wouldn't want to invite Discord to a wedding. Seems sort of counterproductive. And so they do not invite Discord to the wedding. Discord, being the mischievous goddess that she is, takes a golden apple with written on it for the most beautiful or for the fairest, and puts it on the table with where Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite are sitting. They immediately they start debating who the apple is for. They first go to Zeus, and Zeus refuses to make a judgment call. Who's he going to choose? His wife, his daughter, or his aunt? Right? So he refuses to make this judgment call, and he says, well, there's that farmer, Alexander. He has judged the beauty of sheep several times, so maybe he's the best person to judge who this golden apple should go to. So with Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite in tow, Hermes leads them down with the apple and says, hey, Alexander, hey, farmer, who I should mention is not raised as a Paris or Alexander is not raised as a prince in Troy because of a prophecy that he will bring about the destruction of the city of Troy, and that Hector will be the one who tries to prevent it, but will be unable to prevent it. And so his parents, much like Oedipus, send him off into the country and he's not raised as a prince. So here he is, farmer Alexander, and Hermes approaches and says, I want you to judge these three, who's deserving of this apple. None of the three, of course, play fair, all of them offering Alexander a bribe. Hera offering him royal power. So essentially, you will go and be Priam's successor and rule over all of Troy. Athena offers him victory in war. You'll be a great general, a great warrior. And Aphrodite offers him the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen. It doesn't matter that Helen is married at this point. Helen, she gets to decide what happens with Helen. So she's going to give Helen to Paris or to Alexander. It's fitting that he chooses Helen when it's these other two things that he will need would need in order essentially to keep Helen as his wife. So he, of course, like I said, chooses Aphrodite. She receives the apple, and now Alexander is promised Helen. Alexander, or now Paris, goes on a journey to Sparta to take his bride, the woman he was promised. But there's just a little problem. Like I said, Helen is already married, and not only is she already married, but because so many of the princes of Greece wanted to marry her because she was just so beautiful, each had sworn an oath to each other and known as the oath of Tyndareus, that if anyone were to not respect Helen's marriage, which was to Menelaus, Agamemnon's brother, that each would take up arms against that person who didn't respect the outcome of this contest for her marriage. So the oath of Tyndareus, it's bolded here for a reason. So that's not a term you should remember. But here we have Paris strutting his stuff, coming to Sparta, led by desire and love. And when he gets there, Helen immediately falls in love with him. It's not hard at this point it doesn't take much for Paris or Alexander to convince Helen to come with him, and they sail to Troy from Sparta. That's not to say there aren't alternate variations of this. I do mention in an alternate version has Helen basically on the trip home. She remains in Egypt with Proteus, who's this sort of like sea creature, sea monster. And it's sort of like more like a ghost or a shade of Helen that Alexander or Paris takes back to Troy with him. Regardless of regardless of the story or what happens with Helen, what this is what's called this is a violation of Xenia. We've talked a little bit about Xenia. I've mentioned Xenia. I'm going to mention Xenia a few times here today. But if you remember when I talked about Xenia once before, so this is basically a social like a socially constructed way of living, where basically if someone came to your house and they knocked on your front door, you were obligated to let them into your home, to bathe them, to feed them before asking them their name, and give them a bed to sleep in that night. You only required this for one night, and then when they left, you would give them a little present, and they would get to take that present. Presumably, next time you're in their neck of the woods, the same would happen. And in the Greek world and in the Roman world, the same. They form these guest friendships, these friendships all over the world, all over different cities, that allowed them to travel amongst different cities, and they would have places to stay. Paris violates this Xenia when he takes Menelaus, who he's staying with, at his house, when he takes his wife. So with Helen abducted, and they sail to Troy. What's interesting about this is a battle that is the battle, and basically on the two sides, different gods and goddesses sort of pick their sides in this war. If you notice there is one glaring name who is not present, that being Zeus. But we have Athena, Hera, Poseidon, Hermes, Hephaestus, and Thetis, all on the Achaean side. And I should mention, this is a good point, I guess, of mentioning it. So the quote unquote Greeks, I'm not often going to call them Greeks here because these are, at this point in time, each city is sort of its own little, it's a city state. Each city is a city state that sort of like represents itself. The Achaeans being the largest group, and most often the name by which these quote unquote Greek forces are called, the Achaeans. And then on the Trojan side, we have Aphrodite, Ares, Apollo, Artemis, and Leto. Of course, Aphrodite, who promises Paris. I mean, she's kind of the reason this is happening. Athena and Hera, of course, fighting against the Trojans partly because they weren't chosen. Ares because he loves Aphrodite. Apollo and Artemis, and then and Leto. Let's get to know some of the Trojan heroes and the Achaean heroes. So some of the names worth knowing are Agamemnon and Menelaus, these two brothers who we're actually going to talk quite a bit more about in depth next week. Achilles, a name you should be familiar with, Patroclus, his best friend, and I mean, in later versions, he is his lover. There's not really evidence for that in Homer, but that does become part of the tradition later on. Diomedes, who we're going to talk about, Ajax, and this is Ajax the Greater. We saw his father also sailed in the Trojan War. So I should mention, so Achilles' father sails in the Trojan War, Ajax's father, then we have Odysseus, of course, and then Philoctetes, the group that dealt with the death of Achilles, should know Philoctetes is the one who ends up with the arrows that basically have, or I'm sorry, and the Hydra too, but he ends up with the arrows with the Hydra poison on them. So that's what his contribution is he has the bow and arrows of Heracles. On the Trojan side, we have King Priam with his sons Hector and Paris. Hector, of course, being the greatest warrior of the Trojans. I should mention the greatest warriors on the Achaean side, of course, are Achilles, Ajax, and Diomedes. Achilles, Ajax, and Diomedes. Paris, who's not a great fighter, but he's the reason we're all here. Aeneas, who is the son of, and we've talked about his marriage or his parents. His mother, of course, is Aphrodite, and he is the child of Anchises and Aphrodite, who's the mortal that Zeus forces, who Zeus forces Aphrodite to fall in love with. We have Sarpedon and Glaucus. And we'll talk more about Sarpedon, who's kind of like a fortune teller, and Glaucus, who is outside of Hector, probably the greatest fighter on the Trojan side. We're going to talk about him in relationship with Diomedes. So those are just some of the heroes that you're going to encounter. So now the Greek forces basically, or the Achaean forces now start to amass their troops at Aulis. Of course, as the war cry is sent out, not everyone does want to go to war. Odysseus pretends to be crazy. Achilles actually is dressed up like a girl amongst the daughters of Lycomedes. And so this is not, so again, not everyone wants to fight. Odysseus, it's proved that Odysseus is not mad. Part of the reason he doesn't want to go is because his son Telemachus has just been born. He doesn't want to leave his son. But basically, Telemachus is put in front. So Odysseus is like out plowing the field, but not doing it in a straight line. His son is placed in front of his trajectory, and he stops. And so, again, showing that he is not mad. Then they use Achilles' wiles to basically pick Achilles out of this group of women, or this group of girls, because Achilles, if we take, I should also mention, like, the timetable of this is all messed up, because Achilles is just a teenager as he's fighting the Trojan War, but he has a son who can come fight in the Trojan War, and but he's young enough at this point before the Trojan War happens that he could disguise himself as a little girl. But he's also able to impregnate a girl at this point in time, Didymia, and they have a child together who we'll see later on. And so it really isn't, there's no like logic to the time of these stories. So they start to amass at the island of Aulis, and this really is the first time, and that's one of the things that both Thucydides and Herodotus would talk about, is this is the first time that Greek city-states and these the Hellenes, joined together for the first time to battle against a common enemy. The only problem, while here in Aulis, Agamemnon kills a sacred deer, a deer sacred to Artemis, and she is preventing the winds from letting them sail to Troy. The prophet, guy's name is escaping my mind. The prophet, the prophet Tiresias is summoned. He basically tells Agamemnon that he has offended Artemis, and that he must sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia for the winds to be satiated for them to sail to Troy. This is going to come up again in next week's lesson when we talk about the house of Atreus, because Agamemnon sacrifices, under the guise of marrying her to Achilles, sacrifices his daughter at an altar there in Aulis. And it's once she is sacrificed that they basically are able to sail to Troy, raiding cities along the way. Again, Agamemnon is faced with a choice. The war, his own glory, or his family. And he chooses war and his glory. Okay, so let's pick up where the Iliad begins. And this is in year 10. In a nutshell, what is happening is there is it begins, there is a plague in the Greek camp. The Greeks have abducted Chryseis, whose father, Chryses, who is a priest of Apollo, they've abducted her. And Agamemnon, because he wants to keep Chryseis, refuses to give her back to her father, who is a priest of Apollo. Even after Agamemnon is ordered to return Chryseis, it is only after much convincing that he agrees to finally send her back to her father. Rather than just letting this go, he demands that so one thing I should mention, this is why I have this here, is essentially as the Achaeans are moving along and conquering these cities, they're taking war prizes, and they're distributed by these kings to their best fighters and on down the line. The king always getting the best stuff, and depending on your rank or your valor, that would determine like what level of stuff you would get. These war prizes are called time, not time, but time. The more stuff, the more time you got, the greater your kleos, or your glory in war. Very often, the stuff that you would bring back, this time, these war prizes that you would bring back, would often be the gifts of exchange in like these relationships of Xenia. Part of this time, though, would be women who would be slaves. It's actually in Euripides' is Hecuba, where Hecuba actually even says it is women's lot to be slaves. That seems to be the truth in Homer. It's the women who are going to be forced to be slaves when the men don't see. And actually, it does even mention it in the Iliad when Hecuba, or when Achilles, Hector goes to Andromache, his wife, for the last time, and she sort of mentions, how unfair it is that he'll get to die and she'll be forced to be a slave. So Chryseis is a war prize. And so Agamemnon, because he's the king, he's in charge, he's got to have more stuff than everyone else, demands Achilles' war prize, his time, who is Briseis. Because, and don't let the movie Troy fool you, it's not because he's in love with her, but because of the slap in the face to have his time taken away, that Achilles refuses to fight. He refuses to fight. Not only does he refuse to fight, but he wants the Achaeans to be punished. So what does he do? He sits by the sea, he pouts a little bit, cries to his mommy, and his mommy goes to Zeus and asks him to punish the Achaeans for slighting her son. She gets Zeus she reminds Zeus that it is with her help that he was able to escape. When, if you remember back when we talked about Zeus, there was this attempt by Athena, Hera, and Poseidon to overthrow him, and Thetis is the one who unties his ropes. She reminds Zeus that it's her that helped him and prevented him from being overthrown. And then this image represents something that she does is she touches him on the knee and grabs him by the beard and makes him swear to her an oath. Zeus can't break oaths when he swears an oath under this ritual. It's also here that Thetis is told of the prophecy about her son, which she relates to Achilles, that basically he has this choice of having no glory, living a long life and dying an old man, or living a short life but having his name remembered for all time. Of course, we do remember Achilles, and maybe that's a little foreshadowing, Sorry, spoilers, Achilles dies. So Zeus, so like I said, we begin with this plague. So basically, the plague ends when Chryseis is sent back, but then basically Zeus turns the tide, and the Greeks start, or the Trojans start winning. After all these years of fighting, and the Trojans and the Achaeans agree that Menelaus and Paris can just duel one-on-one for Helen, and that whoever wins will be the victor. The Achaeans will leave. It would take Helen and leave because Menelaus wins. And if Paris wins, they'll pick up their camps and leave. During this duel, Paris throws his spear at Menelaus, barely missing him. Then Menelaus also misses, but is able to knock Paris over. And here's the issue with these gods and goddesses being involved, is basically as Menelaus is dragging Paris and going to kill him, she breaks the strap and then takes Paris away. This is a great point of shame for Paris. If you've ever read the Iliad, Hector sort of calls him out about this later in the Iliad. But Paris is saved, but it's also at this moment that basically a arrow flies from the Trojan camp, striking one of the Achaeans, and warfare breaks back out. So now let's talk about Diomedes. There's this wonderful scene that we learn a lot about Xenia, but we also, this is where we sort of learn the tale of Bellerophon, is in which book of the Iliad is that? Let's see if I can remember. I feel like it's. Well, while I'm looking this up, so what I'll just sort of tell you a little about Diomedes. So Diomedes is essentially outside of Ajax and Achilles. He's the best fighter of the Greeks. It's book 6 of the Iliad. We have this moment where Diomedes, and this happens a few times in the Iliad, but this moment where Diomedes goes and faces off against Glaucus, one of these great fighters of the Trojans, and they basically stop right in the middle of the battlefield. I know this is super practical, and they talk about their guest relationship to one another. Basically, they look at each other and are like, "You seem familiar. You're a really good fighter. Hey, you seem familiar. You're a really fighter. Don't we have some sort of guest relationship?" And then basically Glaucus says this: "There's a city, Ephyrae, in the corner of the horse pasturing Argos, and there lives Sisyphus, that sharpest of all men. Sisyphus, Aeolus' son, and he had a son named Glaucus, and Glaucus in turn sired Bellerophontes, the blameless. To Bellerophontes, the gods granted beauty and desirable manhood, but Proitos in anger devised evil things against him and drove him out of his own domain. So Bellerophontes is sent on a mission to fight the Chimera. To fight the Chimera. I didn't adjust that, but I made the picture a little bit too, but that's okay. And it's basically what we know is so after he kills the Chimera, so after Bellerophon kills the Chimera, he kind of like has to fight and work his way back. And it's basically Oeneus who basically gives Bellerophon a place to stay, lets him stay there for 20 days. And it's Oeneus who is the ancestor of Diomedes. And so because of this guest relationship, because one of Diomedes' ancestors once gave safe haven to one of Glaucus's ancestors, they are now friends. And not only that, they aren't going to fight on the battlefield any longer. And on top of that, they stop right in the middle of the battle and they exchange armor. Diomedes getting gold armor, Glaucus getting bronze armor. So because of this past, and I should mention, I want to talk about the Chimera for a second, but I'll do that here in a second. But because of this past relationship, they agree not to fight each other on the battlefield anymore. They're essentially friends, even though they're fighting on these different sides. But it's clear that one is getting much better stuff than the other. I mean, gold armor, although impractical on the battlefield because how soft gold is, the value is much higher of gold armor than bronze armor. So let's talk. I do want to talk about this because I didn't get a chance to talk about Bellerophon earlier. But basically, we have this instance in the story of basically where Bellerophon Bellerophon's stepmother attempts to seduce him to sleep with him. Bellerophon refuses to do that, and then his stepmother lies to his father and says that he has attempted to rape her. Because of this, Bellerophon is sent on this journey, basically. He's expelled, right? Is that right? I feel like I'm maybe misremembering. So she went, to Proteus the king and utter her falsehood. Would you be killed, O Proteus? So Antea, the wife of Proteus, was stricken with passion to lie with him, and yet she could not beguile valiant Bellerophontes, whose will was virtuous. So she went to Proteus the king and uttered her falsehood. That he tried to lie with her in love, though I was unwilling, so she claims to have been unwilling. And the king gets angry, and instead of killing him, he basically so Bellerophontes goes to Lycia, basically, and when he came to this rushing stream at Xanthos, Lycia, the Lord of War, like he had fell, um, basically took pity on him because there was a note that he should kill him. He entertains him, sacrifices 9 oxen. He sent so. Oh, actually, no, he doesn't take pity on him. He welcomes him and then sends him on this labor to kill the Chimera. And I should mention, and I do apologize. Like he is, the king here is Paris's father-in-law, and of course, the Chimera, if you notice here, is this lion body with a goat head growing on the side and this snake for a tail, and it breathed fire. It breathed fire. The description is this. I love it. So none of my approaching a thing of immortal make, not human, lion fronted and snake behind, a goat in the middle, and snorting out the breath of a terrible flame of bright fire. Bellerophon kills the Chimera, and then, like I said, has to make his way out of this land where people are hostile toward him, and it's there that Oeneus takes care of him. So essentially, Bellerophon is expelled from his own community and is forced to do an impossible task. So if we think about just like Achilles, right, and what we learn from Achilles is that often these heroes are sent to do these impossible tasks. I mean, the same thing was true with Jason, right? Sent on this impossible task as a way of sort of dealing with them. And what is it that makes the hero is very much the ability to accomplish this impossible task, even though it's not supposed to happen, right? So Bellerophon, much like Jason, Achilles, Theseus, I mean, all of these Greek heroes accomplishes this task. So we have this like nice little mini epic, this nice little mini myth inside of the Iliad recounting this. And it's also, especially for a book that very much is telling the outcome of this negative Xenia, here we have a positive representation of this social construct of Xenia. Okay, so Diomedes, like I said, is brutal on the battlefield. He goes on to wound Aeneas, Aphrodite, and Ares. That should tell you just about how powerful he is on the battlefield, especially his ability to wound Ares. So I'm sorry this is getting a little long, but we still have a little bit ways to go. But basically, the Greeks, or the Achaeans, particularly Agamemnon, realizing that he is wrong, and realizing that it's because of Achilles, that the lack of Achilles that they're losing, sends a envoy to Achilles, trying to convince him to come back and fight for the Achaeans. He offers him several gifts, including tripods, gold, women slaves, to give Briseis back, basically the first pick of the spoils of Troy when it's sacked, one of Agamemnon's daughters, of course not Iphigenia, and then basically lands and citadels when he gets home. Achilles rejects this because he's still angry. One of the interesting things that happens is Zeus gets angry about the participation of all these gods in the Trojan War, and he doesn't want them participating. And so we have this instance where Zeus, to sort of prove his point, we have the death of his son Sarpedon. And what's interesting is in the Iliad, this is one of his most beautiful and beloved sons that he allows to die. We've actually seen this image, the death of Sarpedon, earlier in the semester, where we talked about Hermes, because we actually have Hermes, night and death, taking Sarpedon into the underworld. I don't want to talk more about that, but just so what is important to know, though, is that we have people on both sides, children of gods and goddesses, fighting and dying on both sides of the Trojan War here. I know. It's a lot. Okay, so now we're getting closer to the end here of the Trojan War. Basically, the Trojans are pushing the Achaeans back. Zeus is basically keeping up with his promise to Thetis to punish the Greeks. Patroclus finally gets Achilles' basically consent to go fight and to put on his armor. Achilles does warn him not to advance past the ships, but only to save the ships as the ships are burning around them. What's interesting is that, so he's fighting, he's having success, and Apollo tricks and basically convinces Patroclus to go beyond. And it's when he does that Patroclus encounters Hector. So this is sort of the first instance we have of Hector. But Hector, of course, is the greatest of the Trojan generals, and just all around sort of badass here. So, like I said, Apollo tricks him into charging 4 times. When he attacks the last time, he basically knocks off his helmet. Patroclus drops all of his weapons, and then his armor just like falls right off. Here we have Patroclus, no armor, no weapons, naked, and Hector kills him. It's because of this that Achilles returns to the fight and demands not only the armor, and actually that's the other thing. When these Greek heroes die, taking their armor is a big deal. It's an important part of this sort of like the glory you got. And so when Hector kills Patroclus, he takes Achilles' armor because he's wearing it. And I should mention, he believes he's killed Achilles, not Patroclus. But he puts on the armor of Achilles, which is something you should never do. Before Achilles returns to battle, Hephaestus makes him new armor, and he returns to battle with this new armor. Before the last sort of like battle between Hector and Achilles, and I would be remiss if I didn't show this, we have the scene where Hector returns home for the last time. If you remember, there was this prophecy, I mentioned this prophecy about the destruction of Troy. And it is that Hector will die trying to defend the city from being destroyed. Well, that's a great general will die. Hector refused to lose him, but basically, and so he goes to fight. And this is, of course, like I mentioned, where Andromache says that it's women who are doomed to become slaves. But this is, I mean, I don't have time to kind of go through this, but here, if you're going to just definitely read book 6 of the Iliad. That's where Glaucus and Diomedes is, but that's also this last scene between Hector and Andromache. This, of course, sets up our last battle, our battle between Hector and Achilles. Basically, as they're fighting, Zeus, so this is how it's described in the Iliad, Zeus pulls out the scales of fate, and unfortunately weighing Hector's death against Achilles, and it's Hector's death who is going to come about. Apollo, who has been Hector's aide, forsakes him and allows Athena basically to trick Hector into thinking that he can win the day and into fighting Achilles. This is sort of the pinnacle. So if you remember earlier, I talked about how like a lot of this book is about the rage of Achilles. This is the pinnacle of his rage. So Patroclus is dead. Achilles is pissed. He has to, and I should mention Hector is of course wearing his armor. And Hector's like, this isn't personal. This was business. I didn't mean to kill your friend. I'm so sorry. Just promise me that you won't defile my body if you defeat me, and I'll make the same promise. Achilles, in return, says that not only am I going to beat you, but I'm going to eat your flesh like a dog eats flesh. Again, Achilles' rage, right? He's not, at this point, he's not a man. He's filled with this rage. I'm going to eat you because I hate you so much. I'm just going to eat you. Achilles defeats, like I said, Achilles defeats Hector and then hitches his body up to this chariot and drives the chariot around the city, dragging Hector's body behind him. Again, I should mention Achilles' rage is still raging, and it's not until Priam, sneaking through the camp, guided by Hermes, comes to the tent of Achilles, begging for the body of Hector back. He looks into the face of Priam and sees his own elderly father's tears, and his rage is finally satiated. Returning the body of Hector to Priam. And this is where the Iliad ends, with the funeral games for Hector. But of course, there's more, right? Sorry, like I said, long lecture. Because we got to get to the war. We got to get about returning. So Achilles is eventually killed with an arrow that's shot by Paris, guided by Apollo. Of course, it hits him in the heel, which, as we all know, I'm sure this is all part of the myth of Achilles. We know Achilles' heel is the only vulnerable spot on his body, because when his mother dipped him in the river Styx, that's where she held him by. He's hit in the heel with an arrow, and it kills him. People around him fight for his armor, but it's Ajax the Greater who basically is able to, and this is a vase depicting this, Ajax carries Achilles' dead body from the battle with the armor. The armor, which of course was made by Hephaestus. After Achilles' death, the Greeks don't know what to do. They don't know how. They don't know how they're going to. I guess I've not mentioned this really once, but the walls of Troy are so high, they're really impenetrable. So the Greeks, the Achaeans at this point, don't know how they're going to overcome these things. And they're given a prophecy that they need three things First, they have to go get Philoctetes because the bow of Heracles is needed to kill Paris. So they go get Philoctetes from Limnos where they left him. I should mention they leave Philoctetes on this island because he basically nicks himself with these arrows, and it stinks so bad that they just don't want to take on the ships any longer. And so he just got this like stinky foot. And so close quarters, they don't want him around. And so they leave him on the island of Limnos. Second, they have to go get Neoptolemus, who is the son of Achilles, who somehow, even though Achilles dies at like age like 22, he has a son who's old enough to come fight. Or let's say he dies at age 26. And they must capture this small statue of Athena called the Palladium, which is in the city of Troy. So they need the bow of Heracles, Neoptolemus, who will eventually kill Priam, and the Palladium. Odysseus and Diomedes are able to sneak into the city and steal the Palladium. They are able to bring Neoptolemus, and they bring Philoctetes back. Then, of course, Odysseus comes up with his great plan to build the Trojan horse. Along with this plan, they will, of course, fake leaving, fake surrendering, as they are hiding inside of the horse that they're giving to the Trojans as a prize for defeating them. Laocoon, the prophet, the soothsayer, basically warns the Trojans not to accept this gift from the Achaeans. And what happens to him, actually, we'll jump to this next slide. What happens to him, and this is actually a very famous Roman original marble. This is one of the very few Roman marbles that don't have a Greek original, but basically the serpent of Poseidon comes and kills Laocoon as he is about to uncover, basically break the cover of the Greeks inside the Trojan horse. So here we actually have Laocoon with these serpents grabbing him and his two sons. What's so terrifying about this statue, which is in the Vatican Museum, I'm pretty sure that's right, is you can see the terror on his sons and his face as he's being dragged here into the sea. So, of course, the Trojans tear down part of their city walls, because, of course, that's what you do to bring in this big wooden horse. And because of that, the Achaeans in the middle of the night are able to escape the horse and to burn the city. It's here during the sack of Troy that Priam is killed by Neoptolemus, who kills him as he is at an altar. This actually comes in book 2 of Virgil's Aeneid. So the city of Troy is destroyed. But this isn't the end of the Achaeans here in Turkey. Before their return home, there is a competition. So they're going to basically have funeral games for Achilles, and there's a competition over his armor. Odysseus is able to win the competition over Ajax, even though Ajax believes that he should have been given it to him because he's the one who saved it and saved Achilles' body from the Trojans. And this is actually the plot of Sophocles' play, The Ajax or Ajax. overcome with madness and believing that he's killing Menelaus, Agamemnon, and Odysseus. In the middle of the night after this contest, Ajax kills a whole herd of sheep, realizing the next morning, as he's covered in blood, that he's done, but believing himself capable of doing this, he elects to commit suicide. This is really tragic. This is really sad. It's actually really a lot of people have studied the play Ajax, and a lot of people think that. So one of the interesting parts about this, about Greek tragedy, this is something we learned from Aristotle, is that one of the goals or the aims of tragedy is sort of like to release negative emotion, to be able to watch this thing on the stage of different people in a different time in a different place, and it helps you like sort of release this negative emotion. And this is sort of what he's talking about when he's talking about like catharsis of emotion, the releasing of this negative emotion. And so a lot of sociologists, psychologists have studied this play, and they actually think one of the messages of Sophocles' Ajax is basically that Ajax has PTSD. The madness that drives him to kill these sheep is PTSD. And the Greeks were acutely aware of PTSD. Partly drama is meant to deal with PTSD, like having these performances in the city. Part of their aim is to sort of relieve that PTSD. But we have this one play directly discussing this post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, drawn mad, what does he do? Right? This is the last word that Ajax speaks to you. The rest I shall utter in Hades to those below. He sets his spear up on the ground and he falls on his spear. And I should mention, and part of what makes this so powerful, this scene so powerful, the death of Ajax so powerful, is that Greek tragedies never show violence or death on stage. It's always off stage that we find out about people dying, people being violently hurt, things like that. The Greeks they, I mean, this is again something Aristotle notes, but they never show violence on the stage. The only exception to this is Sophocles' Ajax, where we see Ajax commit suicide on stage. It's a powerful scene. It's a powerful scene, especially when most of the men, at least in the audience, had fought in some sort of warfare. They're dealing with the emotions of what does it mean to go to war for 10 years and to look at your enemies in the face and have to kill them. So there's a real purpose for several of these things that we see as entertainment or we see as this important literature, but there are several important social factors, social factors that go into why these performances are so important in ancient Greece. And Ajax is a shining example of that, of depression, of PTSD, of the real struggle that someone has at the end of warfare to return home, to feel shame for what they've done, all of these different things. Ajax, and they chose Ajax, who, with the death of Achilles, is the greatest hero left, the greatest warrior left in the Greek camp, falling on his spear and not getting a return home. It's powerful stuff. It's powerful stuff. And that's something that interests you. Definitely let me know and I can sort of point you in the direction of some of these things that discuss that. So again, we have, after the sack of Troy, there are several of these Greek tragedies that deal with these outcomes. So like I mentioned, Priam is murdered by Neoptolemus. All of the women, Hecuba, the wife of Priam, Andromache, the wife of Hector, Cassandra, one of their sisters, Helen, and all the other women are given as time, as these war prizes to the Greek heroes. Hecuba is given to Odysseus, Andromache is given to Neoptolemus, Cassandra to Agamemnon, and Helen is returned to Menelaus. Hector's son, Astyanax, is murdered, although he's just a child. In it's got to be Euripides' Andromache. They describe him as being thrown from the battlements of Troy, where his body is dashed against the rocks. There's a long debate about what to do with Astyanax, and they basically conclude that we can't have the son of this great defeated general who could eventually try to get revenge against us. He can't survive. So they kill the child, Astyanax, again. And Aeneas escapes, and we'll talk about that the last week when we talk about these Roman foundations. The Greeks, of course, return home. This is what's called a nostoi, literally the story of the return home. These different heroes, so Nestor, who's the oldest of the city, gets to return to Pylos. We see him in the Odyssey. Telemachus goes to him for advice. Diomedes returns home. His wife has been unfaithful as he's been gone. And this is because Aphrodite has tricked her into sleeping with someone else. Retribution for Diomedes wounding her. We actually see him pop up again in Virgil's Aeneid because he leaves and goes to Italy and encounters and has the opportunity to fight Aeneas in the Aeneid. Philoctetes, again, also returns to Thessaly, but is driven out and ends up in Italy. Neoptolemus basically has to walk home once he's home. And this is actually what we see him in the Odyssey when Telemachus goes to Sparta. He is basically set to marry Hermione, the daughter of Menelaus and Helen. He gets to become a king. Do I have Helen on here? I don't. Helen and Menelaus, they return home safely. For all intents and purposes, they reconcile their marriage, and Helen and Menelaus end up going to this place called the Island of the Blessed, which I talked about earlier this semester. Then, of course, we have Odysseus, and this is the last slide, I promise. Odysseus, whose journeys take him 10 years to get home, where here I'm summarizing the entire Odyssey in one book. He encounters creatures and monsters. He sleeps with a witch and a goddess. He becomes the first and only mortal to hear the siren's song. He goes into the underworld, which is called a catabasis. I'm going to talk about another catabasis. And his catabasis is actually especially important for next week's lesson because he finds out about Agamemnon's nostoi, and that informs his nostoi, his return home. Basically, Agamemnon tells Odysseus to beware of his wife when he gets home. And this sort of informs how Odysseus acts on his return home. He returns home to find his home overrun by suitors. Of course, he kills them all, kills the servants, and he has to basically walk east carrying an oar until someone asks him what he's carrying, and then he finally gets to go home. Odysseus always the traveler. That's a really short thing to summarize the entire Odyssey. Um, I'm assuming most of you have read the Odyssey, though, so I hope that assumption isn't wrong. Um, if you haven't, you, I would highly recommend reading the Odyssey. If you have one thing, if you have a little of spare time this summer, I highly recommend reading the Odyssey. And if you would like recommendations on translations of the Odyssey, let me know. There's a new one that just came out recently that's very, very good. Um, anyway, all right, so that's it. We're going to end here with Odysseus's return. So for next week, we are actually going to be talking. Um, we're going to be shifting pace. We're going to be talking about the house of Atreus. So essentially, what sort of like we're going to see like the backstory of Agamemnon and Menelaus' house, and sort of this push beyond like the Nostoi, and sort of what happens with the generations of his home. We're also going to be doing Orpheus and Eurydice next week, because we just sort of I need to talk about Orpheus somewhere, in Eurydice, and this idea of catabasis. So we're going to also discuss that next week, and then we'll sort of like move forward from there. So as always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. And I hope you enjoyed this lecture. I know it was kind of long, but I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless, and I hope you have a great week.